September 11, 2001, a date that it just defines modern history. It's synonymous with this immediate visceral trauma. But while the nation was still buried in the ashes and chaos of that day, struggling to even process the scale of what happened, something else began. A second wave of terrorism.
Yeah, and this one was invisible, insidious. It was delivered through, of all things, the United States postal system.
Something so benign, so everyday.
Exactly. It was a nightmare that unfolded slowly, turning ordinary mail into a deadly weapon. We're talking about the 2001 Anthrax attacks, which the FBI officially calls Amerithrax. And this event, it didn't just kill 5 people and sicken 17 others.
Yeah.
It exposed this terrifying vulnerability in our national security and our public health infrastructure.
It really did. It forced the U.S. government to completely rewrite its playbook for biological defense.
Complete.
And that is really the mission for this deep dive. We are going to go beyond the headlines, beyond the political fallout, and really analyze this unprecedented collision of a criminal investigation, forensic science, and a completely chaotic initial public health response.
We're going to dissect the murder weapon, so to speak.
Yeah, we're going to trace the scientific breakthroughs that narrowed the suspects down to a single flask in a single lab and grapple with the enduring questions around why the case was closed and what price we really paid for being so utterly unprepared.
And we have to start by recognizing the human cost here. I think that's critical. The attacks resulted in 22 total cases. 11 of them were inhalational, which is, the most dangerous form.
The deadliest.
The deadliest. And 11 cutaneous.
Yeah.
5 people died. And that includes postal workers, Joseph Curseen Jr. and Thomas Morris. Think about that. Parts of the United States Congress were physically shut down.
Entire buildings.
Tens of millions spent on decontamination. And the FBI launched one of the largest, longest investigations in its history. All because of spores, mailed in a few ordinary envelopes.
Okay, so let's unpack this timeline, because the attack wasn't a single event. It was conducted in 2 distinct ways, right? And they were separated by 3 crucial weeks.
And the differences between the letters themselves are really telling.
Very telling.
The first wave was sent just 7 days after 9/11, postmarked September 18, 2001. And these letters, they deliberately targeted the media.
Powerful figures, too. Tom Brokaw at NBC News, the New York Post.
Exactly. The intent was immediate maximum panic. You hit the institutions that shape how people see the world.
And the message in the letters, it reflected that. It was aggressive, it was raw. The text read, 09-1101, this is next take penicillin, with a spelling mistake. Now death to America, death to Israel. Allah is great.
And what the FBI analysts noted immediately was the near total lack of standard punctuation. It was almost like a stream of consciousness. And the handwriting was huge, right? Roughly twice the size of the letters that came later.
So then the second wave hits.
3 weeks later, October 9, 2001.
And this time, the targets were political.
Yeah, specifically Democratic senators, Tom Daschle of South Dakota and Patrick Leahy of Vermont. So this indicates a very clear shift. You're going from broad public terror to targeting the actual mechanisms of government.
And the language in that second set of letters, it had a similar message, but it was executed differently. That note said, 09-1101, you cannot stop us. We have this anthrax. You die now. Are you afraid? Death to America. Death to Israel. Allah is great.
So you've got punctuation there, periods, question marks.
Right.
The sender was either being more careful this time or maybe trying to signal a different kind of profile.
And what about the physical evidence? The letters themselves.
Oh, they were a treasure trove of detail. Even though they were just mass-produced, they were all copy machine copies.
Which means the originals were never found.
Never. A massive hole in the paper trail right there. And each letter was also trimmed differently, which suggests they were cut by hand after being printed.
And the return address, that was a pretty specific attempt to throw investigators off, wasn't it?
A very specific one. The fictitious return address on the Senate letters claimed to be from 4th grade, Greendale School, Franklin Park, NJ 08852.
Okay, but that zip code.
Right. 08852 is actually Monmouth Junction, New Jersey. And that detail would later become this crucial piece of circumstantial evidence. It links the location not just to a random state, but to a specific geographical point right near Princeton.
Which we will definitely come back to. But crucially, let's talk about the murder weapon itself, the powder.
Yeah, this was not crude stuff. This was not something someone cooked up in their garage. The anthrax spores were highly floatable. Investigators described them as energetic.
Energetic. What does that even mean in this context?
It means it behaved almost like a mist, like an aerosol, when the envelopes were opened. And that characteristic is exactly what made it so deadly. It could just travel through air currents, through ventilation systems, completely effortlessly.
That floatability, I mean, that explains why when the envelope sent to Senator Dash was opened, the contamination didn't just stay on a desk.
Oh no, it was pulled into the air systems. It migrated from the mail facility where it was processed through the entire Hart Senate office building. It contaminated whole floors. There's this image of an intern who described it as looking like baby powder falling onto her dark skirt.
Wow.
That captures just how fine and dry this material was.
And that required these unprecedented decontamination efforts.
Right. It cost millions and took months, in some cases years, to clean up. The Brentwood Postal Facility, where those Senate letters were processed, it was closed for 2 years. And the Senate buildings themselves required this highly specialized, dangerous chemical decontamination. It was a logistical nightmare, the perfect bioweapon, engineered for maximum dispersion.
In that immediate post 9/11 world, there was just this profound, fog of war about who did this.
Of course.
The timing, the language in the letters, Allah is great. It just screamed foreign terrorist attack. The initial focus was entirely international.
Absolutely. The trauma of 9/11 meant that leaders were so quick to connect those dots. You had Vice President Cheney, CIA Director George Tenet, both publicly and privately leaning toward linking the attacks to al-Qaeda or some organized international group. The pressure on the FBI to find a foreign enemy was just immense.
And this assumption, it was almost cemented by a major false report that really captured the national imagination. And this is where the difference between silica and bentonite becomes so incredibly important.
This specific point is just critical for understanding the early chaos and all the misdirection. ABC News, citing 4 well-placed and separate sources, reported that the anthrax in the Dasher letter contained bentonite.
And why was that so alarming?
Because bentonite, chemically, it's a type of aluminum silicate. And it had been publicly described as a signature component, a trademark additive of Saddam Hussein's Iraqi biological weapons program.
So if the anthrax has bentonite, you have an instant direct line to Iraq as the state sponsor of the attack.
Precisely. This report, it was repeated in multiple broadcasts, and it immediately shifted the whole political conversation toward Iraq.
But it wasn't true.
It wasn't true. The White House and military officials, they quickly refuted it. Major General John Parker confirmed that investigators found silica, which is often used as a drying agent, and had been used in the old U.S. biowarfare program. But he pointedly stated that the combination of silica plus aluminum, the ingredients of bentonite, was not present.
So it's this tiny but crucial chemical distinction that completely changes the attribution profile.
Exactly. It shifts it from a foreign state actor to potentially a domestic source, especially given silica's presence in U.S. labs. But the gravity of that false report, I mean, even though it was refuted, it caused profound damage.
It wasted resources.
Wasted investigative resources, fueled public fear about a war with Iraq, and just demonstrated how easily misinformation could circulate and become fact in a climate of intense fear. The bentonite claim was later dismissed, but that seed of foreign involvement had already been planted firmly in everyone's minds.
The whole bentonite controversy, the initial focus on foreign attribution, it just illustrates how fundamentally unprepared the entire system was for this kind of attack. Once the anthrax was confirmed, the FBI had a criminal investigation, but the CDC had a public health catastrophe, and they were figuring everything out in real time.
It was a scenario where the professionals, the local, state, federal health officials, they were genuinely learning on the fly. I mean, the CDC's Emergency Operations Center was trying to coordinate everything, but the public health staff had, and this is a quote, limited science or past bioterrorism experience to draw upon. They had protocols on paper, but no real experience handling a live, spreading, weaponized agent in a civilian population.
And this inexperience led to massive detection failures right out of the gate, failures that cost lives.
Yeah, the clinician recognition of anthrax symptoms, both cutaneous on the skin and inhalational in the lungs, was shockingly low. People were showing up with these strange lesions or what seemed like severe flu symptoms, and they were being completely misdiagnosed.
I remember reading about that. They were being treated as infected spider bites.
Exactly. Infected spider bites. Think about that lag time. You're being treated for a spider bite when you actually have a deadly spore infection working its way through your system.
So the investigation wasn't even formally triggered as a bioterror attack until the first inhalational case, right? Robert Stevens in Florida.
That's right, October 4, 2001. That's weeks after the first letters were even mailed. And that initial failure to recognize the threat, it led directly to delayed treatment and, sadly, to the deaths of people like Joseph Curseen Jr. and Thomas Morris.
And this is where the institutional failures really started to undermine public trust. The CDC, they initially released statements saying postal employees faced minimal risk.
An assessment that was just tragically wrong, as proved by the deaths among the postal workers who handled that contaminated mail.
And then Surgeon General Dr. David Satcher had to go out and publicly admit it. He said, "We were wrong because we haven't been here before." Which, while honest, it just fueled this massive suspicion.
Of course it did. Workers felt the U.S. Postal Service leadership was prioritizing the flow of mail over their safety, maybe even covering up the risk.
And the mixed messages weren't just about risk assessment. They extended to the treatment itself. The guidance on post-exposure prophylaxis, the PEP, the antibiotics, that changed publicly.
Right. Initially, Cipro became the drug of choice. It was the brand name everyone knew. There was panic buying. Bayer, the manufacturer, had to triple its production almost overnight.
But then the CDC updated its recommendation.
They did. They later updated the primary recommendation to doxycycline. They tested the specific Ames strain and confirmed it was susceptible to both drugs. And doxycycline was just as effective, it was significantly cheaper, and it had fewer reported side effects.
So medically, it was the better choice.
It was the better choice. But for a terrified public and workforce, switching recommendations like that, it just looked like institutional indecision. And it further eroded their faith in the authorities who were supposed to be guiding them.
And then you add the anxiety over the anthrax vaccine on top of all that.
Yeah, exposed populations were offered the anthrax vaccine adsorbed, but this was still largely considered an investigational vaccine, or at least a highly scrutinized one. And federal officials never took a clear, definitive stance on whether high-risk workers had to take it.
That lack of conviction, that created a really toxic environment, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The secrecy, combined with the fact that the vaccine was investigational, it tapped directly into this deep-seated historical distrust of government health initiatives. You have to remember the context. Things like the Tuskegee syphilis study.
So for the average person, especially minorities who are already distrustful of authority, the idea of being offered an investigational vaccine by a government that had already misjudged their risk, it must have been paralyzing.
They were being used as guinea pigs.
Exactly.
Postal workers said it very clearly. They felt they were being used for human testing, not being treated. One postal worker, Grace Piantek, she summed it up perfectly. She said, "I'm not going to do anything. They don't know how the vaccine works with people who have been exposed." And that distrust, it just hampered everything. Cleanup efforts, compliance with medical advice, future public health initiatives.
And while all this chaotic public health coordination is happening, we get to one of the most shocking failures of the early investigation, the destruction of crucial, irreplaceable evidence.
This detail is just astonishing. On October 10th and 11th, 2001, right in the middle of this crisis, the FBI and the CDC authorized Iowa State University to destroy its massive anthrax archive.
And this wasn't just a few samples.
No. This collection spanned over 7 decades. It included more than 100 vials of historical B. anthracis samples.
So it's basically a historical library of anthrax genetics, and they just incinerated it.
Wow. The university, they were fearing liability. They were concerned about the long-term risk of housing the archive after the governor had the National Guard secure it. They ultimately decided it wasn't worth the administrative burden.
Unbelievable.
Scientists later universally condemned this decision. They said destroying that archive eliminated crucial genetic evidence. A precise match to a strain in that collection could have instantly provided a much richer distribution history, maybe even a clearer geographical origin of the attack strain. It was a catastrophic loss.
This whole sequence, the misdiagnoses, the shifting public advice, destroying evidence, it all really boils down to this fundamental, irreconcilable culture clash between the agencies involved.
You had the FBI, whose whole mandate is secrecy, control, apprehension of a suspect. And they were actively impeding the CDC, whose mandate is the exact opposite: transparency, wide dissemination of information, and prevention.
And the local officials were caught in the middle.
Completely. The chief health officer for Washington, D.C. complained that he was learning vital facts, like how floatable and dangerous the anthrax was, by watching cable news, not from his federal partners.
The system just wasn't built to handle a threat where the criminal evidence and the public health hazard are the exact same thing.
That tension was just disastrous for the response. It demanded the creation of new coordination mechanisms. And the lesson learned was that there has to be an institutional bridge, formal protocols, decision-making criteria that are established before the next crisis. The cost of that initial institutional conflict was measured in human lives and a lasting, deep public distrust.
So by late 2001, the international leads are pretty much dead ends. The public health response is stabilizing, but it's scarred. And the investigation is just staring into this black hole of uncertainty. The case had to pivot entirely, didn't it? It started relying on a brand new field of science to succeed.
This is where the microbiology really takes center stage. Scientists, notably Dr. Paul Keim, were able to quickly identify the attack anthrax as the Ames strain, and this was the first major scientific narrowing of the field.
And it was deeply unsettling for federal officials. Why was the Ames strain so significant?
Because the Ames strain wasn't some, exotic overseas pathogen. It was a specific strain known to have originated from a U.S. government laboratory housed primarily at the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, USAMRIID, in Fort Detrick, Maryland.
So as one official put it, that was our bug.
That made it USAMRIID. The attacker was almost certainly an insider.
Once that domestic link was established, the pressure, especially from the media, it just focused on USAMRIID researchers with the necessary access. And that's when the name Stephen Hatfill, or Mr. Z, entered the national consciousness.
Yeah, Hatfill was a classic initial profile fit. He was an ex-USAMRIID researcher, he had access to the Ames strain, and maybe most damningly, he had designed and consulted on bioterrorism scenarios for training purposes.
So he had the apparent motive and expertise.
Right, and the FBI became convinced they had their man. Management ordered this intense, months-long, 247 surveillance. They called it bumper lock type surveillance.
Yeah.
Hatfill was publicly harassed, privately tormented. His life was ruined.
He was definitely treated as the prime suspect.
But the irony of the Amerithrax investigation is that the same advanced science that pointed investigators inward was ultimately what cleared Hatfill. Because while he had access to the General Ames strain, later, much more granular scientific breakthroughs determined he never had access to the specific biocontainment suites that housed RMR 20029.
The parental source batch.
The parental source batch they eventually linked to the attacks. So the science conclusively provided him an alibi, but not before his reputation was just destroyed.
So if Hatfill was excluded, how did they get from the General Ames strain to the absolute source of the weaponized powder? This is the core of the microbial forensics breakthrough, and it happened by chance.
It's a classic accidental discovery in science. Researchers working on the cultures of the attack anthrax, they unintentionally over-incubated them. Essentially, they just let the cultures grow longer and hotter than they normally would, a mistake.
And what did this mistake reveal?
It revealed what are called morphological variants, or morphs. When you culture a population of anthrax, they normally look uniform, all the same. But this specific batch, when it was stressed by that over-incubation, it showed these distinct, recognizable colonies. Some were smooth, some were rough, some were slightly different in texture or color.
And these differences were caused by what?
By specific, subtle genetic mutations that had occurred in the original flask over time. They were the genetic equivalent of a unique fingerprint, like birthmarks.
So instead of just looking for the Ames strain, which thousands of labs might have, they were now looking for an Ames strain that had acquired these 4 specific genetic tags that caused these morphs.
Exactly. This accidental signature was the key. The FBI realized that the attack spores were not just any Ames strain. They were a derivative growth from a single specific spore batch created at USAMRIID in October 1997, known by its designation, RMR 1029.
That flask became the holy grail.
It did. The search for the source then became this meticulous global forensic sweep for RMR 129 or its immediate offspring. The FBI created the FBI repository, the FBIR.
A massive collection.
The vast collection of Ames isolates from labs all over the world. Over 1,070 samples were analyzed. They were looking for just those 4 specific genetic mutations.
And the results were incredibly stark, weren't they?
Of those 1,070 samples, only 8 were found to contain those 4 specific genetic mutations that caused the morphs. Only 8. And all 8 of those samples were traceable back to a single source, RMR 1029 and its direct descendants.
And that's definitive.
It was definitive. The murder weapon was traced to a specific flask created and stored at USAMRIID. And this accidental breakthrough, well, it founded the entire field of modern microbial forensics.
So it narrows the field down from foreign terrorists or thousands of scientists to the handful of people with access to one specific flask at one specific lab. And this is where it gets really interesting, because the creator and custodian of RMR 1029 was a man named Bruce Edwards Ivins.
Bruce Edwards Ivins was a microbiologist and vaccinologist at USAMRIID. He not only created the RMR 1029 batch back in 1997, but he remained its custodian for years. So he became the sole focus of the investigation. But before the DOJ could file charges against him, he died by suicide, an overdose, in July 2008.
And after his death, the FBI and DOJ released this enormous, detailed summary arguing that the combination of scientific and circumstantial evidence was just overwhelming.
It was.
So let's delve into that evidence of opportunity first, starting with his lab access logs. I mean, these are concrete, hard data that Ivins couldn't really dispute.
Right. And the key was this extraordinary change in his behavior right before the mailings. Ivins typically worked standard hours. He logged minimal time during nights and weekends in his lab suite, B313. In the 7 months leading up to the attacks, his total off-hours access was under 9 hours, total.
But then, September 2001 hits, the month of the first mailing, and that time log just spikes.
Dramatically. It jumped to 31 hours and 28 minutes of documented off-hours access, just in that 1 month. And in October, the month of the second mailing, he logged over 16 hours.
And what was his explanation for this?
He offered wildly inconsistent ones. He said he was avoiding a bad home situation. He was trying to avoid a specific security guard who records showed wasn't even on his side of the building. Eventually, he just conceded, I don't have a good reason.
Now, early on, the high quality of the anthrax, its purity, its floatable nature, that was cited as proof that it had to be a state actor, that a lone scientist couldn't do it. But Ivins had the capacity, didn't he?
He had the skill, the training, and critically access to the specialized equipment you'd need to take a culture, grow it in a massive quantity, purify it, and dry it to that fine powder. This equipment included a biological safety cabinet, high-speed centrifuges, and most importantly, the lyophilizer.
Okay, for our listener who might not be familiar, what is a lyophilizer and why is it so central to this whole question?
A lyophilizer is essentially a high-tech freeze dryer. To get that fine, floatable, weaponized powder like the baby powder that contaminated the Senate, you need to dry the liquid culture down without destroying the spores. So you freeze the material and then use a vacuum to sublimate the ice directly into vapor. It preserves the spores and creates that highly dispersed, fine particle size.
And Ivins.
Ivins wasn't just familiar with this machine. He was the custodian of the B5 lyophilizer. He trained other people on how to use it. This provided that circumstantial link, proving he had the technical ability to make what was in those letters.
The behavioral and circumstantial evidence compiled by the FBI is just extensive. It paints this picture of a deeply disturbed individual struggling with paranoia and long-term obsession. Let's look at the consciousness of guilt.
Well, one major piece of evidence concerned the deceptive samples he submitted to the FBI repository. Investigators requested RMR 1029 samples from all the labs. Ivins, as the custodian, submitted what were described as questionable samples. One of them didn't even genetically match the original source batch.
So he was trying to throw them off the trail.
The FBI concluded he was deliberately trying to obscure the fact that his flask was the parent material, basically attempting to sabotage the genetic investigation from the inside.
And then there's the bizarre middle-of-the-night garbage incident with the book.
Oh yeah. After his house was searched by the FBI, Ivins was seen acting extremely nervously. Investigators recovered a book he'd discarded, and he anxiously made sure the garbage truck collected it at about 1 in the morning while he was standing outside in his long underwear. The book was Gödel, Escher, Bach, which has a discussion of secret codes, including using bolded letters.
And that was a huge red flag.
A huge red flag, because analysts noted a pattern of potentially bolded letters in the anthrax notes that could spell out a hidden message. So this behavior was seen as evidence of consciousness of guilt, or at least a deep fear of being found out.
But the most unusual, and frankly the longest-standing obsession that links directly to the physical location of the mailing, involves the Kappa Kappa Gamma sorority.
This is truly unique circumstantial evidence. The anthrax letters were mailed from a collection box right outside the Kappa Kappa Gamma chapter house at Princeton University in New Jersey. And Bruce Ivins had a 40-year admitted obsession with this sorority, dating all the way back to his college days.
And this wasn't just some nostalgic interest, was it?
No. His obsession included documented criminal acts. He had a history of burglarizing KKG houses, stealing their ritual material, including a cipher they used to decode secret rituals. He would drive 6-hour round trips just to look at the KKG houses for 10 minutes and turn around.
So the Princeton mailbox
Was 3 hours and 15 minutes away from his home in Frederick, Maryland. a drive perfectly consistent with his long-distance, obsessive driving pattern. The FBI concluded he chose that mailbox because of this deep-seated, decades-long obsession. It was an intensely personal signature on a geopolitical attack.
And all of this was tied to a rapidly deteriorating mental state.
Yeah, Ivins' own emails going back to 1998 revealed profound distress. He feared he had paranoid personality disorder. He expressed concerns about his own delusional thoughts. And the pressure of the investigation just made it all worse.
To the point where just before his suicide, that internal turmoil escalated into physical threats against his colleagues.
In group therapy sessions, he revealed he was the prime suspect. And he confessed to having a detailed, disturbing plan to take out coworkers who he felt had wronged him. He mentioned getting a Glock, having a bulletproof vest, even homemade body armor.
And when he was challenged on it,
When asked by group members why he was making threats like that if he was innocent, the reports say he simply smiled. The DOJ presented this as the conclusive proof of his guilt and motive.
despite the staggering volume of circumstantial and behavioral evidence, the case closure remains one of the most controversial in FBI history. The scientific community especially, they really resisted the idea that the case was definitively solved.
That is the core of the enduring doubt. While the genetic evidence was crucial for attribution, for pointing to RMR 1229, it was not, in isolation, the smoking gun that proved who handled the Flask last. FBI scientist Claire Fraser-Liggett even stated publicly that the scientific evidence alone was not airtight.
And the skepticism culminated in a review by the National Academy of Sciences, the NASACE. What did that panel conclude about the FBI's findings?
In 2011, the NAS panel stated explicitly that it was not possible to reach a definitive conclusion based on the scientific evidence alone. They affirmed that the FBI was correct in tracing the scores back to RMR 1229, but they criticized the FBI's failure to definitively prove that Ivins was the only person who could have produced and mailed the anthrax. They noted that other scientists also had access to RMR 129's descendants.
So the DOJ closed the case based on a convergence of evidence. The science pointed to a source, and the circumstantial evidence pointed to an individual who happened to kill himself before he could be charged. But the scientific basis for his identity was always weaker than the source identification.
Exactly. And the lone wolf theory was heavily disputed by Ivins' peers. Henry S. Hine, a fellow USAMRIID researcher, insisted that the sheer volume and purity of the spores would have taken at least a year of complex work. He argued that given Ivins' small lab space and inadequate containment, if he had produced that material, you'd have had dead animals or dead people in the immediate vicinity from accidental contamination.
And the fact that he didn't contaminate his immediate environment severely complicated the idea that he acted totally alone.
Right. And Senator Leahy, one of the targets, he never fully accepted the conclusion either. He stated that even if Ivins was the sender, he believed Ivins had accessories before or accessories after the fact. The complexity of the attack, combined with the perpetrator's self-elimination, just guaranteed that the case would close with this lingering shadow of doubt.
The Amerithrax investigation was this massive, multi-agency, 600,000 work-hour odyssey. It spanned 7 years, cost over $100 million. And regardless of the controversy around the final conclusion, the attack completely reshaped national security and public health protocols.
Well, the necessity of linking a pathogen to a crime theme created an entirely new research field, microbial forensics. This whole discipline is dedicated to scientifically establishing the source, the origin, the relationship of a biological agent for legal attribution. The work they did to isolate RMR 129's specific genetic morphs is foundational to everything that field does today.
It also forced the scientific community to look inward and address the ethical responsibility of their own research.
That's a profound shift. The American Society for Microbiology, the ASM, which publishes 11 major journals, they instituted new formal procedures. Reviewers of scientific articles are now explicitly required to comment on the possible misuses of microbiology research. It's specifically designed to limit terrorists' access to dual-use bioweapons knowledge.
Like a formal firewall between benign research and potential weaponization.
Exactly.
And on the policy and funding side, the response was a massive, immediate injection of federal resources to bolster defenses against biological warfare.
The increase was just extraordinary. Funding for biowarfare-related research at NIAID, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, it jumped by $1.5 billion in 2003 alone. Suddenly, biodefense was a top-funded priority, and this led directly to Congress passing the Project BioShield Act in 2004.
What was the real effect of the Project BioShield Act? What did it do?
BioShield authorized $5.6 billion over 10 years, specifically for the government to buy new drugs, vaccines, and countermeasures that weren't yet commercially viable. Things like monoclonal antibodies like raxibacumab, designed to treat anthrax exposure. It provided a guaranteed government market to incentivize private industry to develop these products that are critical for national security, but, potentially unprofitable otherwise.
And a huge focus, naturally, was on the existing anthrax vaccine stockpile, Biothrax. How has the government managed maintaining that supply?
It's an ongoing, immensely expensive effort. Between BARDA and the CDC, over $1.2 billion has been spent just procuring and maintaining the Biothrax stockpile. The critical challenge is rotation and maintenance. So to maximize the supply, they're constantly doing research to see if the vaccine can be stretched.
Like reducing the number of doses.
Right. Or by extending the product's shelf life.
And they've had some success with the shelf life, haven't they?
They have. The shelf life has already been scientifically extended once to 4 years, and the goal is to hit 5 years to reduce waste and ensure readiness. The CDC even implemented this rigorous inventory sharing program with the Department of Defense to rotate doses between agencies before they expire.
However, the development struggles for the next generation vaccines, that really highlights just how challenging maintaining a robust biodefense pipeline is.
Oh, it's been plagued by instability and failure. The biggest example was in 2006, when a company called VaxGen won this massive $877 million contract for 75 million doses of a new recombinant vaccine. But the product proved unstable, the contract was canceled, and that money was essentially lost. Next-gen candidates are still in early development, which just illustrates that relying on scientific breakthroughs isn't enough. You need industrial reliability, too.
One of the most critical lessons, and it's one that's often overlooked, is the complexity of the recovery phase. We focus on the attack and the investigation, but the recovery lasts so much longer.
Recovery is historically the longest and most ignored phase in disaster planning, and Amerithrax demonstrated this vividly. The recovery required this complex environmental decontamination far beyond standard methods. The EPA, for instance, had to use $27 million from its Superfund program money that's usually for massive toxic waste sites, just for the Capitol Hill cleanup.
And they used chlorine dioxide gas, right?
Yeah, to sterilize the federal buildings. But that logistical nightmare is compounded by the long-term human cost. The mental and physical health effects linger for years. Postal worker Leroy Richmond, an anthrax survivor, he noted the lasting social fallout after he was released from the hospital. Co-workers keeping a distance, the public's fear of the post office itself. Disaster planning now has to incorporate robust, funded programs for long-term psychological support.
And finally, circling back to part 2, the investigation revealed this dire need for institutional learning about interagency coordination.
The lesson was just painful. Inconsistent communication and conflicting mandates between law enforcement and public health crippled the initial response and eroded public confidence. The decision-making protocols at that intersection of the FBI, CDC, EPA, and local health departments, they have to be clear and standardized. Formal after-action reviews, based on military models, are now essential to prevent the mistakes of 2001, especially the delayed recognition of risk to postal workers from ever being repeated.
The story of Amerithrax is really a chilling foundational text for national security in the 21st century. The critical nuggets we've uncovered today include the fact that the entire case hinged on a complete accident, a scientific discovery, the over-incubation that revealed the genetic morphs pointing to that one unique RMR 1029 flask.
Yeah, and we analyzed the profound public cost of that interagency conflict where the FBI's desire for secrecy just clashed with the CDC's need for transparency. And we detailed the bizarre, long-standing psychological profile of the alleged perpetrator, Bruce Ivins, whose obsession with the KKG sorority became this strange personal clue on a massive federal crime.
What Amerithrax fundamentally taught the United States is that the next biological threat, it can't be solved by conventional policing alone. It requires seamless, integrated protocols that combine cutting-edge microbial forensics, public health transparency, and law enforcement. It was really a foundational, multidisciplinary course in modern threat response.
And the ultimate takeaway, it remains the most challenging one, particularly for those in the scientific community. The anthrax attacks confirmed that the most potent danger may not come from foreign state actors with billion-dollar facilities. It comes from what we call dual-use research.
Critical knowledge used for legitimate defense that can be tragically converted into a weapon by a single insider.
Exactly. Given that Bruce Ivins was an expert, he was sworn to protect the country by developing the anthrax vaccine. So the question remains, can any security screening, Any background check, any psychological profile truly stop a highly skilled individual who is intent on misusing the very science they are sworn to protect.
That ongoing ethical and logistical challenge of managing the insider threat within the biodefense community. That is the true, complicated, and continuing legacy of the Amerithrax case.